So which is the better garden irrigation system between a soaker hose and drip irrigation? Well, this lets you know where I stand. I have tried soaker hoses in the past for a long time and they just didn't work out well for me. Either the hoses would break after a year or two, or they just wouldn't properly leak through uniformly throughout the hose. So I did drip irrigation last year. It was a phenomenal success. So this year the whole garden is getting drip irrigation. Now you don't have to go quite as elaborate as what I did here. I kind of went a little bit overkill. This is a big pump, and the reason why I decided to go with this pump is I had a smaller one and the impeller ended up busting. I then contacted the company to ask if they would send me another one, and they said the shipping would be just about as much as buying a new pump, so they recommended I buy a new pump. I decided not to do that. Instead, I used Fusion 360 in my 3D printer, and I came up with my own impeller. And yes, it does work inside the pump. However, there is one downside to using this style of pump. If you don't put it inside the reservoir, they're going to leak all around the housing. So anyway, a jet pump is the way to go. I think that's what this thing is called. Anyway, there's going to be a link to it down below. And anything that I use to make this, I'll leave links to all the parts you need. But that one doesn't leak. And I wanted something that wasn't going to be leaking and making a soupy mess underneath my deck where all the stuff sits. I wanted it dry. So I decided, you know what, let's just swap it out. We'll change it. We'll put a different sealed pump in there. If your reservoir is higher than your garden and you're just going to kind of be using even gravity type feed system, use this smaller pump or just anything that'll get the water flowing. It does work better than gravity feed. I find those drippers, even if there's just a little bit of water pushing, it just more consistently makes it through your lines to everything. Use the 1/2-inch line to kind of bring your water where you want it, and then use the smaller 1/8-inch, I think it's 1/8-inch tubing, but the smaller tubing that you can see at the ends there. Use that to kind of get the water right directly to the root zone or to the plant, or space it however. I decided for my setup I wanted to use 1-inch plastic tubing, and that's what you kind of see everywhere connecting everything up. Rainbird also makes nice connectors that thread into slip couplers you can find at any hardware store, and that'll let you connect up to that 1/2-inch tubing and kind of spread it out from there. This also let me put valves and stuff in there. I know Rainbird sells the valves, but at the time they weren't available to me easily, so I just ended up putting in T-valves or valves that went right into that 1-inch line, which worked out just fine for me. One word of caution, if you're going to bury any lines like I've done here, going from my whole pump setup and my plenum, I went underneath the grass, kind of the walking path that we've got here. Make sure that you have a really low spot somewhere. Put a T with a valve and an elbow down there. And the reason you're going to do this is if you're in a climate that freezes, which it definitely does where I live, you're going to open that thing up in the end of the year. And because it's your low spot, it's going to drain all the water out from everything, all of your lines. And this way, nothing's going to crack when this stuff all freezes up. All of the drippers that I used last year, every single one of them ended up working. I didn't have to replace a single one. I purposely just left it outside, didn't do anything with it last year. I gave it the brutal test. Let's just see what happens. I didn't have a low spot planned, no nothing. It was, however, all above ground and all relatively flat. So doing that, nothing split, nothing wrecked. I didn't have to replace any tubing from any of the stuff that I had last year. So this stuff overwinters very well. There is kind of one downside to setting up an irrigation system like this, and that's plant spacing. Wherever you put your drippers, essentially, if you pull them out of there, now there's a hole inside your line because they're kind of puncture holes. It's not the end of the world, and I'm kind of found that last year between 12 and 15 inches seemed to work out really well if you follow the irrigation schedule from Rainbird. That lets the water kind of get horizontal as well, not just go super deep into the plant root zone and cover a pretty large area. Now, if you're not sure which drippers that you need for every plant, good thing is Rainbird has got that covered for us. They've got a handy irrigation chart that lets you know which drippers to pick. And what I found is when in doubt, just go with the 1 gallon per hour drippers. That seems to work just fine. The nice thing about this drip chart as well, it also shows you how often you need to be watering your garden in order for your plants to do their optimum best. As a general rule of thumb for me, every 5 days, if it hasn't watered, I water for the duration that's listed on the chart. And more so if I see that the plants are starting to get a little bit parched, or they're starting to kind of sag down a little bit, just hit the pump, let her run again. But the only thing that I found was different, or that I don't like with the Rainbird schedule, is onions and garlic. Those plants, to me, they just seem to like it way wetter than what they're suggesting here. I'll give them a little bit of water probably every other day, 15 or so minutes. And that's kind of why I have that one on a separate line or on a separate valve, is I can do it that way. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is if you're going to be irrigating anyway, you might as well get yourself Master Blend. If you want to learn more about that, I'll leave a card up top. But Master Blend is a phenomenal nutrient for plants. It is a 3-part nutrient. You do need to mix it. And I kind of incorporated that with this setup. I made kind of like a spray bar, just using 2 of those 1/2 inch to 1 inch thread-end adapters. And what this will do is I can turn a valve and that pump is just going to recirculate, but it's going to also recirculate and agitate that whole tote in kind of like a circular motion. This lets me go to my upside or the highest side, and I can put my hydroponic nutrients right in there while I'm mixing it with water from the tap that's right close by here. And this will stir that whole thing up and get that reservoir mixed up. This way I can put hydroponic nutrients anywhere that I can connect with this pump setup. If you're going to do that, just wait to start dumping the nutrients in there. I mean, the first one you can put in right away, but I wouldn't add the second or third till you're at least between 1/2 and 3/4 full, just so you don't have any nutrients binding out with each other and locking some stuff out, or making, I guess, what's the term here I'm looking for? Forget what the term is anyway. It'll make schmutz in the bottom of your barrel, and that's going to go through and plug your drippers. You don't want that. So just, if you're mixing hydroponic nutrients and stuff in there, wait till the tote is like 1/2, 3/4 full before you start mixing it all up in full swing. Also, if you're doing a similar type setup with that vertical spigot, after every nutrient goes in, I make sure I give the top a good rinse to make sure everything gets down and into that tote and gets a chance to get stirred up. Now, cost of this whole system can rise up pretty quick if you went and do what I did there and bought that expensive pump. That pump was like $300. That was easily the most expensive part of this whole setup. Other than that, it's just PVC pipe. The Rainbird fittings and stuff like that, if you're an American, you're well off. This stuff is way cheaper in the US. I actually ended up getting it shipped to a border crossing close by and went and picked it up because it's that much cheaper. It's about 1/2 to 1/4, between 1/2 and 1/4 the price that it is in Canada for the same thing. Most of the stuff, the smaller ends and the fittings, those are relatively cheap in Canada. It's the tubing, for whatever reason, and any of the stuff that's a little more specialty, the tees, the elbows, just get that from the US if you can do a little bit of cross-border shopping if you're from Canada, to keep your costs down. That being said, if you wanted to do this whole setup and you wanted to do it on the cheap, just get one of these small hydroponic pumps. They're like 20, 25 bucks or something like that on Amazon, and they last forever. The only downside to these style of pumps is they don't give you a lot of head height. And that's why I've got the bigger pump. I'm pumping it upwards of 14 feet in some spots to do deck irrigation. Anyway, that's why that pump is there, and that's why I've chosen that pump. If you don't need that and you can just drop your pump in the reservoir, just go with the Vivo Sun and you'll be fine. Oh, I should mention back to this earlier, that pump impeller didn't break. I broke it. I dropped the pump when I was trying to set this thing up. It was just slippery butterfingers, and that was my bad. These pumps are really good from Vivo Sun. Not solicited, not paid for, but they should. Anyway, the next thing you might be thinking about if you do this setup, and this is also why that pump is kind of nice, is if you have a home automation system of any kind, you can go get yourself one of those smart plugs, chuck it in there, and just from your phone, click it off however long you want it to water, set the valves to what they need to be, and walk away, and it's done. Filling the tote, one of those 1,000 liter totes, one ring on the tote, which is about 200 liters, is what it takes for me to irrigate my garden one time at 45 minutes. So that's going to change. It'll probably last for 4 waterings coming up. But even so, that's still 4 times or 4 waterings. That's like 2 weeks if it's really hot and it's really dry. Cost of filling that tote for water in my area is about $3. Hydroponic nutrients for in my area, Canadian prices, is about $10 per 1,000 liters. So cost-wise, that part is pretty cheap, and the results will easily pay for themselves with the produce that you're going to be getting as a kickback out of your garden. I guess about the only other thing we should talk about is when to water. The ideal time to water plants is probably late evening or early morning before the sun comes up and it gets really hot outside. This way you maximize the amount of solution or hydroponic nutrient water that's going down to the root zone, and you minimize the amount of evaporation.